Now we want to transition to our first session on school cell phone policies. And we know so many of you are working on this issue bipartisanly across the country. I'm sure many of you saw the Politico article, even from last week, calling it the last true bipartisan issue. Certainly an overstatement, but we do know there's been so much action on this just over the past year. 44 states as of last month have had proposals in their states on school cell phone policies, and about 29 have implemented some new initiatives in the states across over the past year or so. So a healthy amount for sure. And so to help us guide us through with some insights, a little bit of an overview of a new Phones in Focus project that she's launched in partnership with NGA and with the support of NGA. We're honored to have Dr. Angela Duckworth with us today. Thanks for joining us so much, Dr. Duckworth. Dr. Duckworth is the Rosalie and Egbert Chang Professor of Psychology at University of Pennsylvania. She co-founded the Character Lab, an organization dedicated to advancing scientific insights that help children thrive, and she's the author of Grit, The Power of Passion and Perseverance. All advisors should have that book. You should have received it at registration. Let us know if you did not, and we'll make sure you get a copy. So with that introduction, thanks, Angela, for being here. Thanks, Dr. Duckworth. So let's start a little bit with your new project. If you could talk to us a little bit about an overview of the Phones in Focus and what you're hoping to learn from the project, the questions you're kind of trying to answer and explore.
It's good to see Seth in 3D. We've been in 2D for many months. And really, thank you for allowing me to have a little bit of your very precious agenda. I am a professor, I'm a psychologist, I'm a mom, and about a year ago, my daughters, who are now like roughly 22 and 23, I know that sounds terrible for a mom not to know, but I'm always rounding. I was a math teacher, I was a public school math teacher, so I'm always like rounding up. It's not very helpful for ages, it turns out. But they are like of that generation, and they more or less told me that I should study cell phones and young people, which I sort of, had an interest in because I study goals and I study achievement and I study motivation. And I knew from my own data before being lectured by Amanda and Lucy that cell phones became like the #1 temptation that was named in all of my research. And by the way, not just for teenagers, like for all ages, right? So it wasn't that I hadn't considered this, but around that time, so this is, going back a year, I was reading the research. So on one side, there was John Haidt, whose research, of course, was, very successfully, I should say, very publicly shared through National Governors Association and other, channels that said like, oh my gosh, this is a crisis, and we have social media in particular, which is responsible for the huge increase in mental health problems in adolescents. And then, and maybe not everyone in the room knows, but there were people in my tribe, which are research psychologists, who felt exactly the opposite. They were like not on John Haidt's side, and they were like, oh, he's diminishing the real causes of the adolescent mental health crisis, which have to do with structural opportunity and racism and climate change and more. So then I had these two sides, and basically, to make a long story short, I have this job because I can't sleep when I don't understand something. So I was like, oh my gosh, I need to know what the answer is, and more important, practically speaking, like what should we be telling governors, district superintendents, school principals, classroom teachers, and parents about phones? And so I teamed up with really, and I think, Seth, that like we would agree, like just the best economists in the field and maybe in the world. And when I go to states and I say like, please do the Phones in Focus study, which I'll tell you what it is, I say like, really, this is like Beyonce and Taylor Swift. Like these are the kinds of economists that you would want working on this policy. So they may not know who like Matt Jensko and Hunt Alcott and the other economists are, but they knew who Taylor Swift and Beyonce is. So here's what we're doing. We found from our research talking to school leaders and state leaders, that actually everyone has an intuition that school cell phone policies are important because kids are in school for half of their waking hours. And I don't need to tell this group that if you are looking for a lever to change society, like school is the lever, right? Because, I mean, why did we all go into education? I think there was some logic there. So we decided to focus our energy on schools and cell phones, as opposed to all the other avenues, what kids do when they go home and on the weekends. And then when we started talking to these leaders, it became abundantly clear that nobody really knew, even in a district, like what the policies were, and certainly not what the particulars are of policies that had the best student outcomes. So you would talk to a district superintendent of a large district, and they would say, I have 14 schools, and I couldn't tell you what their specific policies are because we have these district rules, but really we don't know. So this is what the Phones in Focus study is, and I'm so grateful. Every time I get on a call, like what matters more than grit is that I have the National Governors Association imprimatur, but what we're doing is we have a 5-minute survey. If you want to take it, you can go to phonesinfocus.org, and when you get to the part that says like where are you, like what's your high school, you could just put in like I don't have one, and then we will exclude your data. But this 5-minute survey just asks you, and this is really targeted at public school educators, whether they're from district or charter schools, and we ask you what the phone policy is at your school, and we ask you in a structured way. I'll share a little preview of the findings in a moment, and we ask you what it was. And we were just having a conversation introducing ourselves about, as you know in public policy, it's very hard to do random assignment controlled experiments. In this study, we're doing the next best thing, which is we are going to look at changes in policy as they predict changes in student outcomes. And that's not a random assignment study, but you can get pretty conclusive results. Well, you can try to infer causality. We want to know which policies cause the best student outcomes. So I'll just pause there and just say that that is the project, and I was wavering because I was a little bit busy before this, opportunity made it, but then my daughters told me to do it.
And I love that it's this combination of the personal and the professional that really drove you as the catalyst for the work. I know so many of us are parents as well, and have that kind of same drive. I know as I've talked to advisors over the last year, some of it has been around, I'm a parent, I'm struggling with this, and I want to try to move these forward, these policies as well. And your differentiation of thinking about the bell-to-bell or the instructional hours, or how much encouragement and to districts to be able to do this work and cover from the state level is so critically important. So can you share a little bit about what you found so far? Yeah, exactly.
So we launched the survey on April 8th, 2025. That was the earliest we could, get the funding lined up, get the technology to work. I don't have to tell the people in this room, given your focus is education, you're like, wow, April's maybe not the best time to be launching a survey, right? It's the very end of the school year. There's a lot of standardized testing going on. I would agree with you entirely. But nevertheless, we got over 20,000 educators in all 50 states. And I would be happy to share with you the results. I do want to say it's not only bipartisan in terms of red and blue. I will say that one of our fiercest advocates has been the American Federation of Teachers, but also the major national charter school groups, right? So it's an issue, I think, that does, bring people together, in part because we are not advocating, we are trying to support and inform by adding educator voice into this debate. So here's what we have found from these 20,000 plus educators who very graciously, did what I would call a 5-minute favor. So there are two dimensions of school cell phone policies. I think one has been talked about a lot, and the other one has been talked about a little, but they're both important. The one that's in these state laws that Seth was alluding to concerns when students are allowed to use their phones. You can be in a school and a state that says there are no restrictions on when students can use their phones. It's basically up to individual teachers. And by the way, that doesn't mean that students are allowed to use it during academic classes. There are really no schools in the United States who are like, pull out your phone during algebra. But it can be up to the individual teacher. So that's one way to handle the when question. You could also say scheduled restrictions. That's another option. You can say we are a state or we are a school, where you can use your phone during like passing periods or during lunch, for example. That's another common policy. And then there are increasingly bell-to-bell or away for the day schools. And that typically means you cannot use your phone from the first bell to the last bell. So that's a when dimension. I will tell you what the data look like for that, which is that the stricter the policy in terms of when students are allowed to use their phone in our cross-sectional snapshot of 20,000 educators, the happier the educator and the lowest, the lower the amount of in-class distraction. So stricter the better on when. Here's the data on where. And I insisted on this question because I have been studying self-regulation in teenagers for over 2 decades. And there is a basic principle in psychology when it comes to regulating your temptations. And I really say that inclusively because who among us doesn't have things that you're like, I wish I hadn't eaten that, I wish I hadn't said that, I wish I had done that, So for teenagers and all the rest of us, the principle is called situation modification. And it says that the farther a temptation is from you physically, the weaker its kind of like psychological pull on you. So physical distance creates psychological distance, right? If you don't want to eat something and it is right in front of you, it's really hard not to eat it. But if it's even like 4 feet away, well, it's still hard not to eat it, but you have to like do this, right? And that will, actually slow you down a lot. It creates, and then what if it's across the room? And then what if that dessert is out of sight, out of reach, in another room altogether? So dessert we can understand, but I think we all have enough experience with our phones to say, oh yeah, I wonder if it would work with that kind of temptation. So in a national study that I did before this, we surveyed kids all over the country. We did it in partnership with Gallup. So it was a nationally representative sample, including kids who were really at the lowest end of the socioeconomic spectrum, and we had to do like mail forms, and so can't use internet and so forth. So what we found is the question is this: you are studying for a big test. Where do you keep your phone? It's multiple choice, and there's like the first option is like sound on, screen up. I want to get my notifications right next to me, and then there's face down right next to me, sound off. And then there's these gradations. The farthest away we measured was in another room altogether. And what we find in that data, as well as other data, the farther the phone, the higher the GPA. It's a monotonic relationship. So when we came to design this study for the National Governors Association, we added a question, not just on when, but where students are officially allowed to keep their phones during the school day. Because you can be a bell-to-bell school, Seth, right? Okay, don't use it from the first bell, but you can have any policy on where. Many of those schools who are bell-to-bell have no policy on where students are allowed to keep their phone. The most common policy in the United States, according to our data, is the no-show policy. That is, you can keep it anywhere you want. You can keep it in your backpack, you can keep it in your back pocket, just don't show it, right? It's a kind of don't ask, don't tell policy, and that's about half of the schools in our sample. But there are other ways to do this. You can also have, you have to keep it in your hallway locker, right? There's another policy that says your classroom teacher collects it at the beginning of the period, gives it back to you at the end of the period. There's also schools in America that say you have to turn it in at the main office, you get it back at the main office at the end of the day. There are many schools, and we were having a conversation here early in the morning, like about yonder pouches, right? Many, raise your hand if you ever heard of yonder pouches. Okay, right, so those are the magnetized pouches. That's another way to do it. And there are a very small number of schools in the country, mostly elementary schools, that say our rule is that you cannot bring your phone to school at all, right? Like fewer than 2% of schools. But basically, here's what we're finding in our snapshot. It's cross-sectional. We're turning it into a movie when we get more data and we can make it longitudinal. But here's what we're seeing in the cross-sectional snapshot. Not only is it that the stricter the policy, the happier the educator, and the less the distraction for when, the same pattern for where. which did not surprise me as a psychologist. So the farther students are from their phones physically, the better their outcomes in our cross-sectional snapshot. So what I'm discovering is that there's a lot of appetite, there's a lot of interest. Educators have been curiously absent, I think, from the debate. They are very eager to say what they are seeing because they are the ones with kids all day. And we are finding that not only does it matter when students are allowed to use their phones in elementary, middle, and high schools in the country, but also where they are allowed to keep them, a dimension that so far has not really been discussed much at the legislative level.
That's great. Really interesting to hear your initial findings. And so the stricter the policy, the better we found so far, and the where is really important, and the importance of educator voices you're developing and implementing these policies, since that'll be the ones in the classroom. So you mentioned about the self-regulation. Want to talk a little bit about the intersection between the school cell phone work that you're doing and some of the work that you've done for many, many years on life skills and most famously on grit, right? So how does that intersect with what you're working on right now?
So I do love grit. I mean, look, the basic thesis of grit is kind of so obvious, I can't believe people buy my book, but it's like, you want to do something well. It's not just natural talent, right? And we all know this because, we have these conversations about what each of you do, and it's like, you just know all these things that you weren't born knowing, right? And through many, many hours of focused work, you develop skill. And it's true if you want to be a great swimmer, it's true if you want to be a great violinist, it's true if you want to be a great policymaker, it's true if you want to be a great public speaker. So I think these personal qualities, which, I think, you can call them, some people call them character strengths, some people call them life skills. Many governors like to call them life skills. Economists sometimes call them non-cognitive skills because they're not the same thing as IQ, so that's the term that's often used in economics. There are many who call them social emotional competencies, but they are things like grit, but also curiosity, intellectual humility, kindness, empathy, right? So I think these personal qualities are very important. That's another term you could use, personal qualities. I have, in the last 10 years, become very interested in everything outside a child that also is important. So yes, personal qualities are important, but so are schools and after-school activities and culture and climate. And so why this cell phone policy issue is so important to me is that one of the most important things, I think, is in the situation that surrounds a child, are we helping them or are we hindering them to make the use of their grit and their talent? And I think if we don't create a school environment in which they can be successful, then we are, omitting just a very important part of the thriving equation. So sometimes people think like, oh, well, why is this psychologist who studies personal qualities now studying the situation? If you really understand human psychology, you realize all of us are connected with our situation in very, very profound ways. And if you can put a really gritty kid in a school where hard work pays off, where there's a lot to learn, where they have a caring, demanding teacher who's going to bring out their best, then you see this. But if you put the same gritty kid in a school where there's not a lot to learn and there's not a lot of excellence role models, and you don't have the demanding, caring teacher, then you cannot, so to me, the situation and these life skills, personal qualities, are intimately connected in a way that's very hard to communicate. I have found it much easier to talk about grit and hard work than it is to talk about the importance of schools and classrooms and education, something you probably could have told me before, but I find it to be more difficult.
Yeah, so not just thinking about the skills that we're trying to imbue in students and the holistic skills as well as the academics, but also the environment and conditions for that learning.
And how they're related. They're so related.
They're so related. Yeah. And you mentioned how your personal evolution on that. How have you seen having been in these conversations, especially as part of the Character Lab, have you seen the national conversation sort of shift, more paying attention to that, more engagement on those issues?
Maybe, but let me say a little bit about why I think they're so related to give you a little bit of psychological science on how, when you talk about education and people think, oh, it's what's outside a kid, and then but then there's grit and that's inside the kid, but you're like, wait. But if you really think about it for 2 or 3 more beats, you can really understand how they're so related, right? Like you can't take them apart. So I have recently become obsessed with Michael Phelps, right? I mean, that's my job. I study people like Michael Phelps. So I study outliers in human achievement. And it's been a while, but I think we all know that he is the greatest swimmer in history. He's also the most decorated Olympian in world history for any sport. He broke 39 world records. He broke so many world records, he broke the world record for breaking world records. And so I want to bring up Michael Phelps because I think if you think of Michael Phelps, you think, well, a lot of people think talent, right? He's 6'4", he's double jointed in his elbows and knees. I mean, you couldn't design a better, nautical vessel if you were an engineer, right? So first people think of talent, but then you're like, hey, by the way, he swam 50 miles a week, 52 weeks a year. If anybody here swims and you're like, wow, could I swim and by the way, not leisurely swimming, right? So then you're like, oh wow, he has grit, right? For many years, Michael Phelps trained 365 days a year. That includes Christmas, his birthday, New Year's, Thanksgiving, right? So then you're like, oh, wait. This is not just a story of talent. This is also a story of grit. But what I want people to understand is you can't fully explain Michael Phelps if you don't explain his environment as well, right? And this is why, again, why I think the work in this room is the most important work. So Michael happened to grow up about 10 minutes away from the leading aquatic youth program in the country, North Baltimore Aquatic Center. It wasn't like your neighborhood pool. They had a 50-meter pool outdoors. They had a 50-meter pool indoors. They recruited coaches from around the country, including Olympians and Michael's own coach, who turned out to be the world's best swim coach. So when you look at Michael Phelps, you're like, take the same kid with the same genetics, the same height, the same double jointedness, take his grit, right? But put Michael in an environment without the most demanding, caring, expert coach in the country, without 50-meter Olympic pools where he could train 365 days of the year, where the norm for 11-year-olds was 5:30 a.m. practices every day of the week, and you don't get Michael Phelps. I contend that you would not have 39 world records. So to me, if you look at the trajectory of Michael Phelps and you look at his grit, right, he probably started off very gritty, but I think he became even grittier. He had even more passion, more resilience, and more perseverance because of his environment. And just because we're in this audience, I have to say, Michael had the world's greatest mom, Debbie Phelps, who is a lifetime public school educator. Even after her son got extremely famous and very wealthy, she stayed working for the Baltimore County Public Schools. She raised him when she was a middle school teacher, working full-time. Parents split up, so she was basically a single mom. She never quit her job. Then she became a principal, and then she stayed working in very different, different administrative capacities. So he had a very psychologically wise mom who realized that this kid who was really gritty and really talented and really ADHD, which he was, and he was on Ritalin, he's very public about it, that she was also able to create an environment in which she could be successful. She went to go talk to his public school teachers and was like, okay, I know he's a pain in the ass. I know, you're writing me notes, I'm getting those notes, But he is a really bright kid, and I know he can achieve in your classroom, but you have to let him like get up out of his chair and walk around the back of the classroom. So anyway, I just want to say that I think the environment and these life skills are so intimately tied. You can't hang around with a kid for more than a minute and realize that when you put them in a great environment, you bring out their grit. You make them passionate, you make them persevering, and you put a kid in a position where there's nothing to learn and nobody believes in them and nobody will ask, like, what is special about you? And you get a kid who doesn't look very gritty and maybe doesn't even grow up to be very gritty. So I'm kind of trying to, blur the line, I guess, between these personal qualities that many governors care about and also another thing that governors care about, which is education, because they go hand in hand in a way that is so intimate you cannot pull them apart.
That's great, and I love that story. It really illustrates what you're talking about the importance of talent and grit and environment, and then the importance as well of parent and family engagement in education. We're going to go to questions from the audience in just a few minutes, but just as we sort of finish up our conversation, what are you most excited about? What are you looking forward to? How governors' offices can really use this information as you study it, as they go to build and change and strengthen their state policies?
Well, I would like some help. So you might ask, I know you all took planes here. Well, not everybody, but most of us took planes here, right? And it's a bit unfortunate. I took a plane here from Philadelphia, and I am motivated in part to share what we already found, but I'm really actually motivated to see if, just knowing about this project, we are trying to get 100,000 teachers to fill out our survey this fall, especially in October, which is around when, the dust settles and the rosters are stable and you don't have, the more urgent things that are on your mind. So we are trying to get teachers from every public school in the country, especially the middle and high schools, because that is where you see, actually, paradoxically, the more lax policies. So I just told you that in our cross-sectional snapshot, the stricter the policy, the better the outcomes. Well, in the high schools, and that's adolescence, that's when you're really, really not so great at regulating your impulses developmentally. That's actually where the policies tend to be more lax. So we are trying to get a handful of educators from every school. I know that sounds ambitious, but look at the work you do. Why not? So we're trying to get the word out. We have partnerships with most of the states in the country, but not all of the states in the country. So I have a little map. Seth has it too. We have them color-coded. By the way, green or not green, not red or blue, just green or not green, whether we've reached out, whether they're sending out newsletters to their superintendents. So I would love, if you're curious about whether your state is on board, I'm going to give you my personal email address. So you can email me at angela.duckworth@gmail.com. And so it's angela.duckworth, and you could just say hey, I was just wondering whether Virginia's on board, or whether Washington's on board, or whether Ohio's on board. And the answer will be yes or not yet. And we would love to have any connections. I got into the states I got into through calling watershed partners. I was but we haven't been able to reach every state, and we really would like to.
Awesome, and we're happy to help connect you as well, and through this project and with Angela.
Am I allowed to ask a question?
Yes.
First of all, thank you for not knowing how old your children are. My daughter sent me a thing the other day about what she wanted for her birthday. I'm like, is she going to be 26 or 27?
So hard to
I know. I was like, but do you have a boyfriend? Anyway, different question.
There are more urgent questions.
Yeah. So I love your discussion of non-cognitive skills. And as we're trying to think about all the different things, which is how I sort of interpreted your school cell phone policy and environment, skills, setting, a lot of us have talked about durable skills, soft skills, but I interpret non-cognitive skills as different from that. And my ears perked up when you talked about curiosity, because I'm worrying a lot about the disappearing early career talent jobs. And one of the things the private sector is saying is the skills like curiosity and even kindness, I heard the head of Blackstone say the other day, are the things that will help students be, or young adults be successful in the future. And so is there a way to measure these non-cognitive skills? And is there a construct? We've done a lot of work on constructs around durable skills. Is there a similar construct, or is it the same only with a little shading for the non-cognitive skills?
So I will give you just a very quick, like these terms mostly are used synonymously. So economists actually tend to like the term non-cognitive skills. So folks like Jim Heckman at University of Chicago, and by the way, not only are these terms used synonymously, they mostly encompass basically everything that is not narrowly standardized test cognitive ability, right? So it does include curiosity and kindness, empathy, sense of humor, creativity, and so forth. So these umbrella terms, at least from the academic standpoint, tend to be sort of like everything that's not an IQ test kind of thing, or not a standardized test. So, so economists like non-cognitive skills. Many governors like life skills. There is also terminology that but basically I'll just say, to answer your question of, can you measure it? Like, can you more systematically build it? The measurement thing, the answer is kinda. I mean, that's the one word, answer. But you mostly measure these things with surveys, right? And that's the kinda. Because you ask people questions, like if you are interested in curiosity, which by the way, if you look at labor data, curiosity emerges as a very important predictor, especially now with AI and so forth, because you have to be wanting to know more. That's the scientific definition of curiosity, wanting to know more, right? So you can measure it with questionnaires, but the questionnaires are kind of asking you questions about whether you're curious, right? So one of the challenges of these, call them non-cognitive skills, call them character skills, call them social-emotional skills, call them life skills, is that they're typically measured with surveys asking you to judge yourself. And that means kinda, because it's not as convincing, I think, to policymakers as an objective standardized test, which we do not yet have for most of these competencies. So I think that's one of the policy challenges, is that, how do you measure them? And I will refer you to Jim Heckman, who was one of my mentors early on. So if you ask the question, like, what do scientists know about how to measure these? I mean, there are scientists like Jim Heckman and others who are making, inroads, but it's very, very hard to measure creativity, curiosity, empathy, kindness, sense of humor, grit, et cetera, other than asking you questions, like, how gritty are you?
Thanks, Governor. So for the question, Sana?
Good. Is it morning or afternoon? Morning.
I don't know.
Still morning. It's all a blur at this
Depends on
point.
what time zone you're in.
Right, exactly. So we'll do both. Good day. So my question, Anna Joseph Smith, U.S. Virgin Islands. My question is, you mentioned the where in your survey and the when. Some of the dialogue we've been having is how. So is that part of your survey?
Can you say more about how? Yeah.
Yeah, so one argument for why I need to have my cell phone in my hand all day long at school is because I'm using it to research. I'm using it to help me with my work or whatever the case may be in that class. And so I'm wondering, is there an impact, or do you guys have any data on schools who are using the cell phones as tools, and how has that impacted either which way? Are they performing better or worse, or is it just another distraction?
Yeah, well, first of all, I want to say yes. I mean, the challenge is that this thing that we carry around with us, which is kind of like a supercomputer, right? Like, it's amazing, right? Like, you can access free courses at MIT. You can watch videos on quantum mechanics. You can also go to TikTok and hang out there for 9 hours. You can just do so many different things, and they are co-located in the palm of your hand in a supercomputer, right? So I just want to acknowledge that like that makes this really hard. So for many of us, for example, food, right? Food's not something we're so great at regulating either, but at least you can put it in a pantry, right? But it's like you kind of have to live in an ice cream parlor, right? It's sort of the co-location of virtue and vice in the phones in the palm of our hand just make them a special challenge. So I will say that there are schools in our survey who are using technology, including phones, right? Because by the way, not all schools have enough money for laptops, right? For students to use for research and so forth. But since almost all teenagers in this country have a phone, you can, in theory, say like everybody whip out your phone and go look up the following or go to the following link. I will say this, though, as a psychologist who's been studying delay of gratification and the regulation of impulses since I switched from being a teacher to being a psychologist, the co-location of virtue and vice in a phone is not a fair fight. Because it is true that your kids can access videos on quantum mechanics from MIT on their phone. That's generally not what they're doing, right? So I once had my husband come to my class. I teach undergraduates mostly now, not high school teacher anymore. And I was like, my kids, Lovey, are so engaged. And he was like, I'm sure they are. And I'm like, they kind of love me, honestly. Like, just saying, like, I've got that high school teacher vibe. And he was like, amazing. He comes and he sits in the back of my classroom, and he takes a picture. And I would say that 50% of my Ivy League students were buying dresses, watching full-length feature films while they did this. And I'm so that's an Ivy League undergraduate population, right? With a professor who's like singing, dancing her heart out on stage in front of them. I just think that the co-location of virtue and vice in these amazing supercomputers that fit in the palm of your hand, and by the way, it's just like they're so good. These kids, they're just so just like. So I think that is what makes it a really difficult, challenge. I think the co-location means that yes, you can access the world through your phone, and many schools are under-resourced. Probably, you would argue most public schools in this country are under-resourced. But when you have to make policy decisions, I would say that because of that complexity, you probably do want to physically separate learning from entertainment.
Mm-hmm. Great. All right, we'll go to Marjorie next.
Hi, Marjorie Yano from Ohio. You mentioned briefly your students in higher education. There was an interesting article, I think from one of your colleagues at the University of Pennsylvania in the New York Times a couple weeks ago about he implemented a cell phone and computer ban. I think so, yes. Yeah, in his classroom at the higher education level. I'm curious if you're hearing anything or seeing anything in the higher education space around sort of cell phone policies and how that, if that conversation is moving its way into higher education and where that might take us as sort of state thinkers in that space.
So if you haven't caught this op-ed, I thought it was great, actually. Zeke Emanuel wrote an op-ed about his own personal experience as a university instructor and the challenge that he was having with Ivy League students who were not necessarily paying attention in the ways that he expected and wanted. And I will tell you at the university level, there is a similar battle going on, right? Because you just can't compete. Like, you just cannot compete with like an amazing TikTok video. Oh my God, like reality is sped up, by the way, right? Like, it's like, the images per second, it's like, it just hits all of our dopamine, hotspots. And so I think that at the university level, what you're finding is a similar version of what is happening at the K-12 level. And there are increasingly university professors, including yours truly, who have no device policies, right? And it's kind of crazy. Like, it does feel a little bit like paternalistic and maybe even kindergarten to tell my Ivy League students spending like, what, $80,000 a year for the privilege of being in the classroom? Like, we have to have these rules that are like stated very clearly in the syllabus. And I actually have to have my TAs walk around the room to make sure that the rule that you cannot have your device in sight in my classroom, like not only do we have to have that state in the syllabus, put it in the syllabus quiz, but literally every hour and a half, my TAs walk around the classroom and your grade goes lower if you have a device out. So, you know, I think that the K-12 issue is where, of course, pre-K-12, please, 0 to 18 is where many governors are focusing their energy with good sense. But one of the things that just makes this, I think, more understandable is like, who among us doesn't also have this problem, right? I'm 55 and I find it difficult in a boring meeting not to just for 1 second, could I, you know, or even do things like check your email, right? So I think this idea of using physical distance to create psychological distance is maybe one of the techniques that policymakers for all ages, you know, including higher education, can help ourselves, you know, do what's good for us in the future versus what's immediately gratifying.
I really like the way you put that, the co-location of virtue and vice in the palm of your hands.
Yeah, I mean, you can
really
learn
captures
quantum mechanics on this thing, but usually you don't. So.
And the implications for
Yeah.
pre-K and higher ed as well. Maria, I know you were out, you had a question
And also,
as
yeah, I
well.
don't think you can see that side of
Oh,
it. I'm just saying.
okay, I'll come
like,
over that
also,
way
because
too.
I can,
Thank
and
you.
yeah.
I'll just say it really low. Oh, okay. That's fine. Maria Ness at North Dakota. So we have a bell-to-bell, but we're looking at kind of the 0 to 8 space, but specifically to elementary, who typically don't have cell phone issues as much.
Yeah.
What is your thoughts? What are your thoughts, I
on
guess,
now.
on just digital access for our littles and getting back to more of a play-based, paper books in our hands, that kind
Yeah.
of experience in education, and less outsourced digital on devices screen time?
Yeah. First of all, North Dakota is #1 in the country. I just want to say Kirsten is the most psychologically wise human being I have met. And so we, your states are very competitive. So I have this like ranking, you know. Maryland's #2, North Dakota's so I think that the, you know, the co-location, right, of learning and digital devices is something where it's like, you know, it's not an easy policy issue, right? Because it is a portal to the universe, right? It is something where I don't think you can say like we should have K-12 education without any digital access, right? And, you know, my friend and colleague John Haidt probably has more, you know, strong views. Like I think, you know, recently we were in conversation and, you know, he you know, no AI until whatever, I don't remember what age he was saying, like 16 or something. Like, I also think, you know, what is the purpose of education? Well, partly it's also to prepare these kids for the economy. And, you know, like, I don't know that it's realistic or responsible to, like, forestall, like, interaction with digital technology to the point where you are going to have less of a chance to be competitive in an economy. So it's complicated. But I will say that when you look, for example, at learning, and you ask the question, like, do kids learn more from, you know, scrolling on a screen versus like reading in hard copy? I mean, there the answer is that reading in hard copy is better, right? And there's been a meta-analysis, which is a study of studies, a meta-analysis. And so, for example, in my classroom, and I do plant trees. I assure my environmentally conscious students that I plant trees, but we go hard copy. I'm like, you know what? I know the research. Therefore, I'm giving you a hard copy of these articles. You are going to write in the margins. You're going to like turn the page. You're going to have it just there. Like you're like, oh yeah, what did that say? And it's going to be there, right? So especially for nonfiction, retention is higher when you read something in a physical medium versus on a screen. So these are complicated questions, but I do think that the co-location of education and entertainment, you know, the co-location of, my mom just said I have to get picked up at 3 and not at 3:30 because my dentist appointment changed, with TikTok, makes this extremely challenging. And I don't have all the answers, but I do think that policies should be informed by data. And there are experts on this, and the experts are teachers. They are the experts on children, and they are with these kids all day long. They know things that policymakers don't always know. They know things that psychologists don't always know. And so that's, our logic was let the teachers speak. Let the teachers have a medium in which they can say what is happening in the classroom.
All right, well, I know there's a lot more questions. We do have to move forward. We are at time.
I'm going to stick around for a few minutes if it's okay during your coffee break. And then I got to fly back to Philadelphia. But I just want to say also Seth is the easiest person to work with in the universe. And so I don't know how many public opportunities I'm going to have to say that. But we've been kind of good friends actually since we started working.
Awesome.
And also I just so respect you. When I went into education, my father didn't speak to me for 6 months. He was like, why do you want to help poor kids? And I was like, well, that's a longer answer. But I will just say that I don't respect anybody more than you for flying here, for doing the work you're doing. All of you could get paid more for doing something else. You know that. So I just want to really say I so thank you for your time, and I thank Seth and the National Governors Association, and I would love to work with your state. Thanks.